Hey peeps! Welcome to another video. Today it is part 2 of the Butterick 6018 sew along. Today we're going to be sewing the bodice. So let's get started. The first thing that you're going to want to do is to mark your darts, and I like to snip into the legs of my darts, and then I put a pin through the point and fold the paper back and use a friction pen to make a mark on the fabric, which I can then join up with the dart legs later with my French curve. I'm going to do that for all the pieces, so the backs and the fronts, and I'm going to do it for the outer and lining pieces as well. You want to make sure that you've snipped all your other, or at least marked all your other notches in at the same time. We're not going to worry about this mark because that's where the zip's supposed to stop, but I've moved my zip to the back seam, so we don't need to worry about this one. The first thing I'm going to do is interface the neckline of the front lining piece, and as I showed you earlier, I've trimmed down the facing piece just to be 1 inch wide, so this sits nicely into the stitching line, which I am going to draw on, which will help me get this point nice and curved and even on both sides. I'm going to attach this now, being very careful to not remove my friction pen marks here because I don't want to have to repin those, and I'm doing it before I have sewn my darts or pinned my darts so that everything is nice and flat and much easier to manipulate. I've also drawn in my stitching line, and this is going to help me later to get a nice and even neckband. This is the 5/8 of an inch mark, and this point down here is actually where the large circle on the pattern piece was. So I've gone down to there, and I'm going to use this as my stitching guide when I sew my lining, which this is, to my main fabric, which I will be doing later. First, I have to sew some darts. When I'm sewing darts, I like to match up the 2 snips that I've made in the legs of the dart and then the point of the dart, and then I put my pin through the line and make sure that it's hitting the line on the other side all the way along. You're going to want to backstitch at the start, which is at the end of your dart, and you're going to stitch all the way along and sew off the end of the point. Don't backstitch at the point because that will add too much bulk there. We're going to come back and tie knots to secure those a little bit later. I've sewn all my darts, and as I said, I've backstitched at the start of them and just sewn off the end of each of the points. So now I need to secure each of these, and I'm going to do that by tying the threads into a couple of knots, and I'm going to do that for each dart. Once I've tied them off, I'm then going to clip the ends and press them, and you want to press the bust darts down and the center darts into the center. So these ones down and these ones into the center. I am actually going to sew all of the other darts at the same time, so I'm going to do the lining piece, I'm going to do the back piece, outer and lining, and get those all done at the same time, which is something that I like to do. I like to do as many of the same operation as possible before I have to get up and press anything. I've finished sewing in all my darts, and the other thing that I'm going to do before I get up and go to the ironing board is sew the back pieces together from the neck edge and down to 3 inches, and I've just marked that with my friction pen, and I've done that to both the lining and the outer piece of fabric, and that's just so that I can press that flat and install the interfacing that I have cut out. So for the front piece, I narrowed down the interfacing because I didn't need it to be like 4 inches deep at the front, but for the back piece, this has a built-up neck that sits up quite high along the back of your neck, so I wanted to make sure that there was reinforcement there, so I've cut out the entirety of the facing piece, and I've cut this out on the fold as well. I didn't feel the need, because I was sewing this top piece closed, I didn't feel the need to cut this with seam allowance added, so this is cut on the fold, and once this is pressed open I will then attach the interfacing with my iron, and of course I will show you when it's finished. We've done step 5, which is to stitch the darts in the bodice front. We've pressed the bust darts down and the centre darts in, and we've also done step 8 and sewed the darts in the bodice back, and that's because, as I mentioned, I like to do as many of the same process as I can at once. So we've done this. We've also stitched the top 3 inches of the bodice back together, and we've done that for both the lining and the outer fabric, and the same for the front. We've stitched the darts in both the lining and the outer fabric. We've then kind of skipped back to step 1, which is interfacing, and we have interfaced the front edge of the lining and the neck edge of the bodice back. So the next thing I need to do is stay stitch the shoulder edge of the bodice front as shown. So I'm going to do that on both the outer and lining fabrics. Okay, so the next step is to stitch bodice front sections together, but as I mentioned, I've cut mine on the fold, so we can skip that one. We've done the darts for the bodice back. We're going to move on to step number 9, which is pin bodice back to bodice front at shoulders, clipping bodice front where necessary, baste and stitch. That's why we've just stay stitched the shoulder seams here, so that we can clip into them and maneuver them to line up nicely with the back portion. Having said that, my fabric has a little bit of stretch in it, so I don't need to worry about that too much. But if you do need to clip to make yours work, then please go ahead and do so. Don't clip past the stay stitching. You're going to want to match up your notches. The other thing that we're going to do is stitch the bodice back to the front at the sides, and as I said, we've moved our zipper to the back. We're going to stitch both sides all the way down. I've got the shoulder seams and the side seams all pinned together, and this is the outer one, and then that's the thing that you need to be careful of. You need to make sure that you have the interfacing with the interfacing, so this will be my lining. I'm now going to sew all of these at 5/8 of an inch, press the seams open and then pink them. I've pressed all of my seams open, and I am now going to trim them all with my pinking shears, my lovely Kai pinking shears that were sent to me by the lovely KK. So I'm going to go and trim every single one of these seams, and I like to press them open first and then trim, because I find with some fabrics the pinked edge can sometimes show through when you've pressed it. Press first then pink. That's been my experience. The next set of instructions are for the facing, which we are not doing because we've done a lining. So the next thing to do would be to attach your lining, which is the one with interfacing, to the right side of the fabric, and I've got them right sides together. I've matched up the back center seam, matched up the shoulder seams, matched up the center front, and I've gone all the way around. And as I showed you earlier, I've got a stitching line here to follow for the neckline, so I'm going to stitch all the way around this at 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to trim and clip into the curves, and then we can press it and understitch it. One of the things that I like to do when I'm working with a point like this is I use a normal stitch length till about 1 inch away, and then drop my stitch length down, which just allows me to clip right up to the stitching line with a little more confidence that the stitches will hold. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to clip right down to this point here, trim all of this excess away, and clip into these curves. Another good thing to do is use your pinking shears to do that, because that clips into curves for you and reduces bulk. I'm going to reduce the bulk around the shoulder seams here, and then turn it all out and press it so that the seam allowance is all towards the lining, and then I can understitch. And I won't be able to understitch this area, but I'll be able to do up to around about here and then go the whole way around, and that will just again help the lining to lie and sit on the inside nicely. Once you've understitched and pressed everything, you should end up with something that looks a little like this. So if you have left the center seam in, the curve here is slightly more pronounced, which I liked very much on the previous muslin that I did, but I also very much like this, and it won't be necessary to sew the buttons down the front. I may still do that because I like the idea of it, but it won't be necessary. I think I'm going to be making the other neckline with the fold back collar, and that one I will definitely put the buttons on. Understitching is literally that, so you are stitching the seam allowance to the lining. So as we did before, we press the seam allowance into the lining. You're stitching about 1/8 of an inch away from the actual seam line, and that's securing the seam allowance to the lining piece, and then you just press everything. And with this fabric, it is prone to going a little shiny, so what I'm doing is pressing on the wrong side so that the shine is never going to be on any of the garment that's going to be seen. So you just want to press the whole way around, and that just helps, the understitching just helps the lining to lie nice and flat within the garment. So the next thing we need to do is attach the sleeves. As ever, if you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section down below and I will do my best to answer them for you. I really hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!